The horizon of the East Indies stretched endlessly, a tangle of green islands rising from turquoise seas. Monsoon winds carried salt and promise across waters that had been sailed for centuries, yet few Europeans truly understood them. The islands were alive with markets of cloves, nutmeg, and mace, treasures that could transform a merchant's life or a company's fortunes in a single season. Dense forests hid unknown dangers, venomous snakes, hostile tribes, swarming insects. The seas themselves were treacherous, currents shifting without warning, reefs lying in wait for the unwary. It was a world of beauty, abundance, and deadly risk. In Europe, the Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or VOC, had claimed mastery over this distant expanse. Its flag flew over ports from Java to the Maluku Islands, an empire of commerce and authority unprecedented in scale. Ships like the Batavia were not merely vessels, they were symbols of ambition, statements of power, floating cities designed to assert dominion over both ocean and people. Each journey promised wealth beyond imagination, yet carried risk measured not in coins, but in human lives. Storms, disease, piracy, and miscalculation could turn ambition into catastrophe within hours. The VOC demanded perfection. Every ship had to carry men, guns, cargo, and treasure in precise measure. Captains were chosen for loyalty and competence, but even the most skilled could be undone by a hidden reef, a sudden squall, or the unpredictable temper of a crew under stress. Merchants planned with charts, logbooks, and letters, but the ocean had no respect for maps or commands. The human cost was hidden beneath polished wood decks and the veneer of orderly trade. Sailors were pushed to their limits, suffering hunger, sickness, and discipline as their lives became instruments of profit. In this world of extremes, the Batavia was conceived. She was to be the largest ship the Dutch East India Company had ever built, a marvel of engineering and ambition. Her hull would carry hundreds of men and guns. Her decks would store treasure, spices, and supplies for a voyage lasting months. Every plank, nail, and sail was measured against an expectation. She must survive oceans, storms, and hostile ports, and she must project the power of the company across the world. Yet ambition is often blind. Even the finest craftsmanship cannot conquer human error, greed, or the capricious forces of the sea. The port of Amsterdam buzzed with energy as craftsmen labored on the Batavia. Blacksmiths hammered iron for nails and cannons. Carpenters shaped beams from imported oak, each slice echoing with purpose and tension. Sailmakers stitched canvas with meticulous care, aware that a torn sail could doom hundreds at sea. The men worked under orders from merchants and captains whose eyes never left the horizon of profit and reputation. Each hammer strike, each cut, each knot was an act of obedience, fear, and hope intertwined. And yet, even in the port, whispers of danger circulated. Experienced sailors spoke of reefs along the western coast of Australia, uncharted and lethal. Officers debated over the ship's design, warning that her high forecastle and heavy armament might make her unstable. Some were dismissed, others silenced by ambition and authority. The VOC demanded a vessel that would awe allies and intimidate rivals. Pride and fear conspired to silence caution. Soon, the Batavia would leave these safe, bustling docks, carrying her crew and passengers into the unknown. She would sail across thousands of miles of open sea, through waters that had claimed countless vessels before her. Her voyage would become one of the most infamous in maritime history, a story of ambition, disaster, survival, and human cruelty, frozen forever in the tropical waters of the Abrolhos Islands. But before the waves could test her, the Batavia had to be born, a structure of wood, rope, and iron, an emblem of human ambition and the dangerous allure of empire. In the bustling shipyard, no one could yet know that the ship which promised wealth and glory would also become a stage for murder, madness, and betrayal, a floating world where the human cost of ambition would be written in blood and fear. The Batavia creaked beneath the weight of men, cannon, and cargo as she slipped away from Amsterdam, gliding into the uncertain expanse of the North Sea. The air was sharp with salt and the faint tang of tar from freshly laid rigging. Sailors leaned into the wind, adjusting ropes and masts, muscles straining with every knot tightened and sail hoisted. The ship moved with the deliberate power of ambition, yet beneath the rhythm of work there was unease. Every man understood that the ocean offered neither guidance nor forgiveness. It demanded obedience, endurance, and vigilance. Daily life was a relentless pattern of labor and survival. The men rose before dawn, eyes red from watchful nights, bodies stiff from cramped hammocks and the sway of the ship. Some were skilled, raised in ports with salt in their veins. Others were conscripts, pressed into service by obligation or debt. All were tied together by fear and dependence, tasks repeated endlessly, patching sails, hauling water, cleaning decks slick with rain or spilled provisions. Even the simplest motion, stepping from one slick plank to another, required constant attention. A single misstep could send a man overboard, swallowed immediately by cold, indifferent waves. Illness and hunger threaded through the ship like a hidden enemy. Salted meat hardened into blocks that tore teeth, stale biscuits crumbled into dust, and water stored in barrels developed a taste that made men gag. Scurvy whispered in the shadows, stealing strength, dulling minds, and heightening tempers. Men coughed in corners, faces pale beneath the brim of a worn hat. Officers inspected the ranks daily, noting those too weak to work, punishing the slow or inattentive, and praising only those whose strength aligned with the ship's survival. Discipline was a constant undercurrent. Lashings, confinement, and verbal intimidation reminded everyone that survival depended as much on obedience as skill. Storms arrived without invitation, testing the Batavia and her crew. Gray clouds pressed down on the deck, wind tearing sails until sailors' fingers bled, and waves struck with unyielding force. The ship pitched violently. Men clung to ropes, to beams, to one another. The smell of wet wood, salt, and fear filled every nostril. The roar of water over the bow drowned conversation, yet orders still had to be shouted, repeated, executed. Each storm was a rehearsal for the unpredictability of the journey ahead, a reminder that mastery over wood and sail was never absolute. Even when the sea lay flat, the human mind remained uneasy. Tension simmered among officers and crew, subtle arguments erupting over food, duty, or the smallest perceived slight. Sailors whispered of dangerous reefs, of past wrecks, of disasters that could strike without warning. Some questioned the captain's judgment, others feared the repercussions of dissent. Every decision, when to raise sail, when to tack, how to distribute rations, carried consequences measured in exhaustion, injury, or death. Life at sea was a continuous negotiation with both nature and fellow humans. The voyage demanded patience, endurance, and a constant awareness of surroundings. Navigators consulted charts that were only approximations, compasses that wavered under magnetic influence, and stars obscured by clouds. The captain's word was law, yet even he could not command the ocean. He relied on the skill of men whose lives hung on the precision of rope, the alignment of sails, and the knowledge of currents. Crew members internalized a rhythm dictated by wind and wave, balancing hope with fear, exertion with caution, and obedience with survival instinct. Isolation amplified every sound, every shadow, every uncertainty. Night brought no comfort. The ocean became a dark, motionless void beneath the ship's hull, stretching beyond perception. Every creak of timber, every slap of a loose rope, every whisper carried weight. Men imagined reefs in the blackness, storms approaching unseen, mutiny stirring quietly among neighbors. Sleep was never deep, eyes open to phantom movements, ears alert to the subtle shifts of water and wood. Every day was a trial, every night a negotiation with fear. Yet there were moments of fleeting beauty. Sunlight glanced off the crests of waves, glinting like scattered coins, and birds wheeled overhead, brief messengers of land or fortune. Sailors caught glimpses of distant shores, small islands, or flocks of fish beneath the surface. Laughter sometimes broke through the tension, brief and brittle, as men celebrated minor victories. A properly hoisted sail, a repaired leak, a meal shared without incident. These moments were fragile, ephemeral, but they reminded men of life beyond duty and fear, of the human need for connection amidst the vast, indifferent ocean. Supplies dwindled slowly as the Batavia pressed farther south. Salted meat hardened further, water grew warm and foul in barrels, and illness thinned the ranks of men already weakened by labor and exposure. Officers monitored rations carefully, aware that uneven distribution could ignite resentment or provoke rebellion. The psychological strain mirrored the physical. Men counted days, weeks, and months without land, imagining home and family, uncertain whether they would ever see them again. Hope was a dangerous companion, for disappointment came swiftly and despair lingered. Amid the routine and danger, small acts of courage and ingenuity punctuated life at sea. A sailor might climb a mast in a storm to secure torn sails, risking fall or drowning. Another might fashion a rudimentary repair for a leaking barrel, saving precious water for the crew. The captain made decisions balancing ambition, survival, and the expectations of the VOC, aware that each order carried consequences measured in human endurance. Every action became a negotiation with mortality. Strength, skill, and awareness determined whether a man would survive the next wave, the next storm, the next uncharted reef. Weeks passed in this rhythm, a tense repetition of work, fear, and fleeting relief. Tension simmered beneath the surface, both in the crew and among officers who vied for favor and authority. Rumors of wealth and distant ports fueled ambition, while the isolation of the sea magnified small disagreements into threats. Life at sea demanded constant attention. One neglected line, one misjudged maneuver, or one misread chart could have consequences cascading across decks and through the lives of hundreds. The Batavia's voyage was not simply a journey, it was an endurance test, a fragile balance between human skill and the unpredictable, merciless ocean. And all the while, the horizon remained indifferent, stretching endlessly, offering no guidance, no mercy, no comfort. The men of the Batavia learned quickly that survival depended not on luck or strength alone, but on constant vigilance, careful execution of orders, and the endurance of both body and mind. Every day reinforced a single truth. At sea, the world was as dangerous as it was beautiful, and human ambition could only ever negotiate with, never conquer, its vast and indifferent expanse. The Batavia stretched across the harbor like a sleeping giant, her hull rising above water with deliberate authority. From bow to stern, every plank, nail, and beam bore the imprint of ambition. The ship was more than a vessel. She was a floating city of wood and iron, designed to carry men, guns, and treasure thousands of miles across oceans that were both beautiful and merciless. She carried not only the hopes of the Dutch East India Company, but the fragile trust of hundreds of human lives, each one dependent on skill, vigilance, and obedience. Below deck, the ship was a labyrinth of chambers, passageways, and cargo holds. Sailors shuffled through narrow corridors, heads bent against low beams, feet careful to avoid slick planks. Every room contained purpose, barrels of salted meat, casks of water, crates of spices, and chests of coins and trade goods intended to secure fortunes in the Indies. The smell of wood, tar, and salt mingled with the sharp tang of iron from cannons, and each step echoed softly against the hull. It was a place of labor, danger, and secrecy, a microcosm of ambition confined by planks and nails. The crew themselves were microcosms of the ship's contradictions. Sailors whispered quietly in corners, sharing rumors of wealth, danger, and the unknown waters ahead. Officers moved with deliberate authority, measuring discipline against obedience, every glance and gesture a reminder that defiance could carry immediate consequence. Merchants counted inventories, inspected cargo, and calculated potential profits. And yet beneath this veneer of order, the seeds of tension were planted. Ambition, greed, and fear had begun to ripple silently through the ranks, unnoticed by those focused on the immediate task of survival and preparation. The ship's design carried both promise and peril. Her towering forecastle and high stern gave the impression of power, yet made stability precarious. Heavy cannons lined the decks, polished and ready, each capable of firing across the seas to defend or attack. But their weight shifted the ship's center of gravity, an invisible threat to balance and safety. Sailors moved cautiously around the guns, aware that the misplacement of a single block or pulley could lead to injury, or worse. The very features meant to project strength were also latent hazards, tangible reminders that human ambition had physical consequences. Even the cargo held secrets. Exotic spices, gold coins, and precious textiles filled crates and barrels, their presence both a promise and a temptation. Hidden among them were personal belongings, knives, small books, religious icons, and letters from distant homes. Each object was a thread of life preserved within the ship, a tangible connection to families and lands far beyond the ocean. The sailors touched these items with reverence or desire, aware that they could be the difference between wealth and starvation, or the spark of jealousy and violence. The Batavia was not merely a vessel of commerce. She was a floating web of human relationships, ambition, and fear. Above deck, the complexity continued. The rigging stretched in a spiderweb of ropes and pulleys, every line critical to the movement of sails. A misstep could snap a rope, tear canvas, or hurl a man into the sea. Sailors climbed masts with raw, calloused hands, eyes fixed on the shifting wind, muscles trembling from exertion. Each adjustment was a negotiation with nature, with physics, and with the unyielding demands of survival. Every movement, however small, had consequences. A poorly tightened knot, a misaligned yard, a moment's hesitation could cascade into disaster. The ship itself seemed to hum with anticipation. Wood creaked as it settled, responding to tides, wind, and human weight. Cannons, polished to black perfection, gleamed under sunlight, silent yet threatening. Even the smallest plank held the potential for catastrophe. Rotten timber, hidden flaws, or unnoticed splits could compromise the hull, and with it the lives of those aboard. Sailors and officers moved with constant awareness, eyes scanning, hands steady, each step a balance of experience, instinct, and fear. The Batavia demanded respect as much as obedience, and yet, even in this environment, human ambition found opportunity. Sailors exchanged glances over crates of coin, whispering about hidden treasures or the possibility of future mutiny. Some officers began to calculate leverage, noting alliances among crew members, weighing loyalty against ambition. Every shadow became potential cover, every quiet corner a space for plotting or survival. The ship's confined spaces amplified both human ingenuity and human danger, binding men together in a fragile network of interdependence and suspicion. Preparations for the voyage highlighted the tension. Rations were measured meticulously, every barrel of water and block of salted meat weighed and stowed. Cannons were inspected, ropes checked for wear, sails mended for the long journey ahead. The crew labored in rhythm, yet each action carried weight beyond its immediate purpose. A misplaced barrel, a slipping knot, or a misread order could have consequences measured in injury, loss, or even death. The Batavia was not merely a test of skill, but a test of human endurance and attention under constant pressure. At night, the ship became a place of shadow and quiet unease. Lanterns flickered along the deck, casting long, wavering shadows across planks and rigging. Sailors murmured prayers or whispered gossip, some trying to sleep while others stood watch, ears alert to every creak and splash. The ocean beyond was dark, silent, and indifferent, reflecting starlight only to remind men of their isolation. Every sound, water lapping against the hull, ropes tightening, distant gulls, was amplified, a subtle reminder of how small and fragile human life was against the vastness of sea and ambition. And beneath it all, the seeds of catastrophe were already planted. The ship's design, the ambitions of men, the delicate balance of weight, and the secrets hidden in crates and cabins created a world where a single misstep could trigger disaster. Fear, desire, and human error were already intertwined in the ship's structure. Sailors walked along the deck, unaware that the very features meant to ensure survival also carried the potential for death. Officers gave orders, merchants calculated, and men labored, each a participant in a drama whose conclusion remained uncertain. The Batavia was more than wood, rope, and sail. She was a microcosm of human ambition and fragility, a vessel where every plank, every rope, every object carried the weight of lives dependent on skill, obedience, and luck. She held the promise of wealth and glory, yet within her hull, unseen by most, lurked the conditions for betrayal, mutiny, and disaster. The journey had not yet begun in earnest, but the ship already bore witness to the tension, hope, and danger that would define the voyage. As the Batavia prepared to leave port, men paused for a moment, sensing the magnitude of what lay ahead. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, both inviting and indifferent. Within the ship, every plank and rope, every crate and barrel, every eye and hand would soon be tested. Ambition and human error, skill and fear, loyalty and treachery, all were already present, invisible threads woven into the vessel's structure. The Batavia carried them all, and she would demand they pay the price for every misstep, every ambition, and every secret hidden within her timbers. The horizon remained deceptively calm, a sheet of pale blue under the relentless sun. Yet beneath the Batavia's polished hull, the ocean shifted with a subtle menace. Currents twisted in invisible eddies, reefs lay hidden just below the surface, and every mile brought the ship closer to waters that had claimed countless vessels before. The men on deck felt the wind's changing pattern, the faint resistance against the hull, the slight trembling that hinted at danger, but few truly grasped the peril awaiting them. The navigator, charts spread across the rail, bent over his instruments with tense focus. Each reading was uncertain, each estimate a gamble against nature's unpredictability. The latitude lines promised safety, but the reefs were mercilessly precise. A single miscalculation would render the entire voyage meaningless, converting weeks of labor and hundreds of lives into splintered wood and drowning screams. Officers paced the deck behind him, their faces taut with concentration, hands brushing against gunwales as though mere touch could summon assurance. Below deck, sailors continued their routines with mechanical precision, unaware of the invisible hazard lurking beneath them. The ship hummed with activity. Ropes were coiled and tossed, sails adjusted, cargo secured, and provisions inventoried. The monotony of repetition did little to ease the underlying tension. Even in these hours of ordinary labor, Each man carried a latent awareness of fragility, an understanding that the line between safety and catastrophe could vanish in a single moment. The first signs of threat were subtle: a sudden, shallow tug on the keel, a vibration transmitted through timber, caught the attention of a few observant crew. The helmsman noticed the bow responding differently to the wind, turning more sluggishly than expected. The navigator frowned, cross-referencing charts with dead reckoning, sensing a discrepancy that could not yet be named. A faint unease began to ripple among officers, their eyes sweeping the horizon with an intensity born of instinct rather than certainty. Hours passed, each one stretching the nerves of those on deck. The sun rose higher, glinting off the water in patterns that obscured the dangerous coral reefs beneath. Sailors squinted against the glare, scanning for signs of danger while performing their duties. Every adjustment of sail, every movement of rope was calculated not only to propel the ship forward, but to prevent disaster. Even a misstep in coordination could send the Batavia careening off course. The ocean offered no warning, only subtle, almost imperceptible signs that required constant attention. The first collision came without fanfare, a trembling shudder that ran through the Batavia from keel to masthead. The hull scraped against unseen coral, the vibration vibrating through planks, through nails, through the feet and bones of every man aboard. Sailors froze, instinctively bracing themselves against the decks and railings. The navigator's eyes widened, realization dawning slowly. This was no minor bump. The reef had found them. Officers shouted orders, urging men to adjust sails, push the helm, and secure cargo. Every action was urgent, precise, and fragile, measured against the deadly permanence of the reef beneath. The ship's timbers groaned under pressure, a sound both natural and terrifying. Cannons shifted slightly in their iron mounts, barrels of water jostled, and crates of provisions teetered. Sailors worked frantically to redistribute weight, tying down objects that could crush men if they fell. The friction of hull against coral cut into the wood, creating resistance that threatened to halt the Batavia's progress entirely. Waves sloshed against the ship with uneven rhythm, amplifying the motion and forcing every man to adapt instantly. Panic simmered just below the surface, suppressed only by discipline and the instinct for survival. From above deck, officers noted the widening array of reef heads. The ship had struck repeatedly, each impact producing micro tears in the hull's integrity. The navigator's hand hovered over charts as he recalculated, every number a gamble against time and tide. A single misjudgment could pin the Batavia irrevocably. Sailors glanced nervously at one another, the tension palpable. They were far from land, far from rescue, and entirely dependent on skill, observation, and luck. Every choice, every movement carried immediate consequences for life and death. The sun shifted, casting long shadows across the deck. Sweat ran down faces beneath wide-brimmed hats, stinging eyes red with exertion. A rope slipped from a sailor's grasp, snapping with a harsh twang that echoed over the water. Another man stumbled while hauling a sail, narrowly catching the rail before disappearing into the sea. The ship trembled again, the grinding of hull against coral louder this time, sending shivers through every plank. Officers barked orders, voices straining to be heard above wind and wave. The crew responded with precision, born of experience, yet fear had begun to seep into their movements, subtle hesitation marking nearly every action. As afternoon approached, the reef grew impossible to ignore. The water changed from clear turquoise to ominous green, shallow tops of coral visible just beneath the surface. Sailors pointed, shouting warnings, while officers shouted corrections. Each adjustment of the helm was countered by the reef's resistance, each sail repositioning met with stubborn friction against wind and weight. The Batavia was trapped in a slow, terrifying negotiation with forces far larger than herself, her movements measured, precise, and dangerously close to failure. And then it happened. A massive coral head tore a deep groove along the keel, splintering wood with a sound that reverberated through the air and decks alike. Sailors jumped, gripping whatever they could to avoid being thrown off balance. Officers barked new commands, and men scrambled to secure cannons, barrels, and cargo, knowing that a single rolling object could crush or drown them. The ship shuddered, listing slightly, and for the first time the crew realized the stakes were far higher than anyone had imagined. They were no longer merely at risk of minor damage or delay. They were facing the real possibility of being stranded, wrecked, and abandoned in a hostile, uncharted world. Panic threatened to take hold. Men whispered prayers, some cursed, some froze entirely. Sweat and fear mixed in the stifling heat of the afternoon sun. Officers pushed forward with renewed authority, attempting to restore order and maintain control. The Batavia's movement slowed, each action countered by the Reef's relentless presence. Every footstep, every rope hauled, every command shouted was a desperate attempt to negotiate with forces indifferent to human skill or ambition. By evening, the Batavia rested precariously atop the reef. The ship was damaged, water began to creep into the lower holds, and the horizon offered no promise of rescue. Sailors huddled in corners, exhausted, aware that this was only the beginning. The reef had not merely impeded the ship, it had introduced a new element into their world, fragile, unpredictable, and dangerous. Every decision now carried immediate consequences for survival. The crew understood, even if only subconsciously, that human error, ambition, and miscalculation had brought them to this moment, and that their fate depended on unity, courage, and endurance they had not yet fully tested. The night fell heavy and dark over the Batavia. The reef below remained hidden, yet its presence was felt in every groan of timber, every subtle tilt of the deck, every cautious step. Men lay awake, listening to the water lap against hull, imagining disaster in every shadow. They did not yet know the full extent of the danger, the betrayal that would soon emerge among them, or the long nightmare that the reef would set into motion. For now, they waited, hearts tight, bodies tense, and minds full of the uncertainty that only a vast, indifferent ocean can impose. The Batavia lay crippled across the coral, her hull groaning under the weight of men, cannon, and cargo. Water seeped into the lower holds, soaking barrels of provisions and spilling across the deck, turning timber slick and treacherous. Sailors clung to ropes and railings, muscles trembling, faces pale with fear and exhaustion. The sun glared down, bright and indifferent, as though mocking their helplessness. For hours the ship had fought against the reef, and now it had surrendered, pinned by forces it could not comprehend or resist. Panic spread quickly. Men shouted, stumbled, or froze entirely, unsure which way to move. Some descended into the lower decks to secure provisions or cannon, only to be drenched in water rising rapidly, the smell of salt and wet wood filling their nostrils. Others ran across the deck, gripping lines and beams, hearts hammering with the knowledge that one false step could send them tumbling into the coral-strewn sea. Every man was acutely aware that the reef, hidden moments ago, was now an unyielding presence, a relentless adversary that would not be negotiated with, bargained with, or reasoned with. Survival depended entirely on human skill, instinct, and nerve. The first injuries came swiftly. A sailor misjudged a step on the slick deck and fell, striking a beam with a sickening crack. Another slipped while hauling a line, scraping his forearm across a jagged plank, skin torn and bleeding. Officers rushed to contain chaos, shouting orders above the rising roar of the wind and the slap of water against the ship. Cannons shifted in their mounts with every lurch of the hull, men scrambling to secure them before they could crush anything or anyone in their path. Every movement was an urgent calculation, balance, timing, coordination, all under the shadow of immediate danger. Below deck, the situation was worse. Water flooded the lower cabins, soaking the limited supplies of food and fresh water. Crates of spices floated, tipping and spilling, the air thick with the pungent smell of cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. Sailors waded through ankle-deep water, boots squelching against soaked planks, eyes darting for weak spots in the hull. Each passing moment carried the risk of collapse. Each second demanded action, or inaction could mean death. Men cried out, some in pain, some in terror, as the ship settled unevenly atop the coral, her timbers creaking under unnatural pressure. Above deck, officers and merchants tried to impose order. Commands rang out: secure the cargo, lower the sails, prevent fires, keep the men from panic. But order was a fragile illusion. Exhaustion had dulled precision. Fear had sharpened irrationality. Sailors argued, some attempting to abandon tasks for safety, others blindly following instincts that threatened to undo collective effort. Leadership struggled against both nature and human behavior, a duel waged with no precedent, no manual, and no guarantee of success. The reef had created a new geography. The Batavia's stern pitched higher than her bow, tilting the decks at impossible angles. Men moved cautiously, gripping rails and ropes, adjusting every step to avoid sliding. Water sloshed unpredictably across the timber, threatening balance. Cargo shifted with every wave, crates clattering into barrels and cannons, forcing men to react instantly or face injury. The ship's once mighty guns, symbols of power and protection, became hazards in themselves, their weight and placement exacerbating the instability. Every element designed to ensure strength now contributed to fragility. Amid the chaos, some sailors took extraordinary action. One climbed the rigging, adjusting torn sails despite the reef's pressure and the wind's unpredictable gusts. Another secured a barrel of water that threatened to roll and crush a man pinned against the railing. Officers coordinated movement across the tilted deck, shouting precise orders, moving with urgency, and demonstrating calm under conditions that could have easily unraveled them. Courage was measured not in heroics, but in the precise execution of tasks under immense pressure. Yet the danger was relentless. The Batavia's keel had been gouged deeply by coral, and water continued to flood below decks. The ship's structure flexed ominously with every wave, every swell of wind, every shift of weight. Sailors and officers alike understood instinctively that the vessel's survival was precarious. Even small mistakes carried outsized consequences. A dropped rope, a misread order, or a misplaced barrel could send the ship lurching further onto the reef, accelerating damage, flooding cabins, and imperiling lives. The reef was not merely an obstacle, it was an omnipresent, patient adversary waiting for error. As the day wore on, exhaustion and fear combined to erode the men's capacity to act. Sweat ran down faces, blinding eyes mingling with salt and spray. Hands ached from gripping ropes and beams, muscles screamed from constant strain, and minds teetered between focus and panic. Some sailors wept quietly, overwhelmed by the realization that the ship could not easily be freed, that weeks of preparation, months of labor, and entire lifetimes of hope had come to a sudden, fragile halt atop coral. Others whispered prayers, their voices lost in the wind, carried across the deck with no promise of answer. Nightfall brought no relief. The water shimmered under a moon obscured by clouds, reflecting broken shapes and creaking beams. The reef remained invisible beneath dark water, yet its presence was palpable in every sound, every movement, every cautious footstep. Men huddled together, shivering from exhaustion, fear, and the cold creeping in as darkness fell. Officers maintained watch, shouting instructions and moving among the crew to enforce vigilance, knowing that a single lapse could turn an already desperate situation into catastrophe. Sleep was shallow fitful, and accompanied by the constant, gnawing awareness of danger. In this fragile stillness, subtle human dynamics began to emerge. Fear bred suspicion, and ambition found opportunity. Crew members whispered about who might survive, who might gain control if the ship were stranded indefinitely, and who might be expendable. Officers observed quietly, aware that discipline could be undermined at any moment. The reef had not only trapped the ship, but had also begun to strain the fragile bonds among men, laying bare ambition, fear, and instinct that had previously been contained by motion, distance, and the routine of life at sea. By dawn, the full weight of disaster was clear. The Batavia rested at an impossible angle atop the reef, water filling lower decks, supplies damaged, and crew exhausted beyond endurance. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a pale light on men bent, trembling, and weary. Survival was no longer an abstract possibility. It had become a tangible, urgent challenge. Each man had to navigate the tilting deck, shifting cargo, and the ever-present threat of water flooding further into the hull. Every decision mattered, every motion carried consequences, and every heartbeat was a fragile measure of life clinging to wood and skill. The Batavia had become both prison and battlefield. The reef had claimed control, dictating motion and limiting options. The men understood that their ordeal had only begun. They were isolated, surrounded by water and coral, with no immediate hope of rescue. Fear, fatigue, and uncertainty mingled with instinct, skill, and courage in a tense equilibrium. Every hour, every choice, every breath would be a test of endurance, collaboration, and the fragile human capacity to confront catastrophe while maintaining purpose. Even as exhaustion gnawed at them, some small flame of hope persisted. Sailors began to organize, officers coordinated efforts, and plans were whispered about the possibility of reaching land or signaling for help. Yet all actions were tentative, measured against the immediate, inescapable presence of the reef. It had become clear that human ingenuity alone would not be sufficient. Survival would demand careful observation, courage, and a willingness to confront the worst instincts in themselves and others. The Batavia had surrendered to the reef, yet she had not surrendered to the men entirely. Every creak of timber, every swell of water, and every rope holding fast was both a warning and an opportunity. The ship had transformed from vessel to world, a confined stage where human endurance, fear, and ambition would play out with deadly consequences. The reef had trapped them, but it had also revealed the fragile balance of skill, courage, and vulnerability upon which survival depended. The sun rose over a pale horizon, spilling light across water that stretched endlessly in every direction. From the tilted deck of the Batavia, the survivors could see only shards of reef and shallow channels glinting in the morning glare. There was no shore in sight, no friendly harbor, no sail on the distant horizon to promise rescue. The ship, once a vessel of ambition and wealth, had become a fragile fortress suspended between ocean and coral, a place where survival depended on vigilance, ingenuity, and endurance beyond what men had known before. Below deck, the flooded cabins were a mess of crates, barrels, and scattered provisions. Water had seeped into stores of salted meat, flour, and water casks, leaving them unfit for consumption. Sailors scrambled to recover what they could, balancing on beams slick with moisture, their hands raw, their clothing sodden. Every movement demanded precision. One misstep could send a man tumbling into the brine below, potentially breaking bones or disappearing beneath the unforgiving waves. The ordinary rhythms of labor at sea had dissolved, replaced by urgent improvisation against a backdrop of rising panic. Above deck, officers struggled to impose order. Commands rang out across the tilted decks, directing sailors to redistribute cargo, secure lines, and maintain balance. But authority was fragile. Fatigue had dulled precision, fear had sharpened tempers, and the long hours of crisis had begun to fray nerves. Sailors whispered among themselves, speculating about the reef's dangers, questioning the captain's judgment, and debating what could be salvaged from the wreck. In every corner of the ship, uncertainty mingled with instinct, creating a volatile tension that threatened both structure and cohesion. Hunger and thirst gnawed at the crew. Water, once rationed but abundant, was now tainted by flood and exposure, barrels tipped and leaking. Salted meat had absorbed water and begun to rot, flour caked into inedible lumps. Men measured each bite and sip with anxious calculation, acutely aware that overindulgence could hasten scarcity and provoke conflict. Even simple actions, passing a barrel, cutting a block of meat, became fraught with negotiation, compromise, and subtle assertion of authority. Survival was no longer abstract. It was a constant, pressing concern, immediate and personal. Exposure added another layer of peril. The sun struck the deck with harsh intensity, burning skin and draining energy. At night, the temperature fell sharply, and moisture clung to every surface, chilling bones and clothing. Men huddled in corners where planks offered minimal shelter, whispering prayers or quietly counting days, unable to sleep. The ocean itself had become a mute observer of suffering, a vast and indifferent expanse that neither offered comfort nor admitted mercy. Its presence was omnipresent, shaping every choice, every movement, every breath. With isolation came a creeping awareness of vulnerability. The reef had immobilized the ship, and the nearest shore was distant and unknown. Sailors began to recognize that survival depended not only on skill and endurance, but on cooperation, a fragile, uneasy cooperation among men who were exhausted, hungry, and frightened. Even the most disciplined officers saw the first subtle fractures in loyalty, whispers of dissent, questioning of orders, and the quiet calculation of who might seize advantage if the situation deteriorated further. The ship was no longer merely a vessel. It had become a pressure cooker for ambition, fear, and instinct. Fear, both immediate and existential, saturated the air. Every groan of timber, every splash of water against the hull, every shifting crate became a reminder of the delicate boundary between life and death. Sailors flinched at shadows, hearing phantom sounds of movement or imagining the reef tearing further into the hull. Above deck, officers scanned the horizon with anxious eyes, aware that rescue might be weeks away, that survival might require ingenuity they had never before needed. Even the simplest decisions, who would stay on deck, who would descend below, who would handle supplies, carried weighty consequences. Amid the mounting desperation, small acts of ingenuity emerged. Sailors attempted makeshift repairs, fashioning supports to brace weakened timbers, plugging leaks with spare planks, and rearranging cargo to prevent tipping. Men collected rainwater in spare barrels, filtering it as best they could. Every success was temporary, fragile, yet vital, sustaining hope even as the reef, sun, and sea threatened to undo them. Each solution was a negotiation with the ship, the environment, and the human limits of fatigue, fear, and skill. Yet as necessity demanded cooperation, human nature began to reveal its darker edge. Ambition and resentment mingled with desperation. Crew members whispered about who might control resources, who might assert dominance, who might survive while others perished. Officers observed quietly, understanding that the delicate hierarchy that had structured life at sea could no longer be taken for granted. Social bonds strained under the relentless pressure of isolation, scarcity, and uncertainty, creating the first seeds of discord that would later erupt into violence. The night brought silence that was almost unbearable. The ocean, indifferent and infinite, lapped against the hull, the ship rocking gently yet unpredictably. Men huddled together for warmth, for comfort, or merely for the illusion of security. Shadows shifted under lantern light, faces gaunt from exposure and hunger, eyes wide with fear. Below decks, water seeped steadily into cabins, leaving men with no choice but to adapt or perish. The reef, invisible beneath the darkened surface, remained the silent executor of fate, shaping every action, every thought, every breath. Isolation deepened with every day. Sailors and officers alike began to measure time not by hours or days, but by the slow depletion of resources and the condition of the hull. The reef had immobilized not only the ship, but the men's sense of control. Each sunrise and sunset highlighted the delicate balance between survival and collapse, between courage and panic. Every decision carried a multiplier effect. One misplaced barrel, one ignored warning, one act of negligence could cascade into chaos. Life had become a continuous negotiation with forces both natural and human. And within this fragile, tense world, the psychological toll became unmistakable. Sleep deprivation, hunger, sunburn, and cold combined to erode judgment. Fear sharpened suspicion. Loyalty weakened under pressure. Every man, regardless of rank or skill, began to confront not only the ocean and reef, but also the limits of endurance and the unpredictability of human behavior. Survival would demand ingenuity, courage, and vigilance, but also careful management of the fragile bonds that held the crew together. By the second night, it was clear that the ship was more than stranded. It was a crucible. The reef had exposed the vulnerabilities of the vessel and the crew, magnifying both ambition and fear, skill and error, loyalty and resentment. Every action mattered. Every choice carried consequence. And in this tense equilibrium, the seeds of catastrophe were already taking root. Human nature, pressed by isolation, scarcity, and danger, began to reveal itself in ways that would soon transform the ship from a vessel of commerce into a theater of horror. The Batavia rested precariously atop the reef, the water rising, provisions damaged, and men pushed to their limits. Yet the worst had not yet come. The reef had immobilized the ship, yes, but it had also revealed the fragile, volatile balance of human society under extreme pressure. Officers maintained what authority they could, sailors obeyed with trembling precision, and beneath the surface, the first whispers of ambition, dissent, and darker impulses began to stir. Survival was immediate, urgent, and tenuous, but the coming days would test not only endurance, skill, and courage, but the very nature of trust, fear, and human morality. The reef had claimed the Batavia, yet the ocean's indifference was matched only by the indifference of human ambition. Days of hunger, exposures, and uncertainty had frayed nerves and sharpened instincts. In the shadows of the tilted deck, whispers began, quiet at first, almost imperceptible against the constant groan of timbers and the slap of water against the hull. Among the crew, a small, calculating figure watched these threads of fear and desperation, weighing opportunity against risk, patience against action. His name was Cornelisz, a man whose mind, disciplined and unrelenting, had found in catastrophe the seed of power. Cornelisz moved with quiet intent, observing the crew under the guise of maintaining order. He noted alliances forming naturally among the sailors, the subtle hierarchies dictated by age, strength, and loyalty. Every glance, every whispered complaint, every fleeting expression of doubt became data for his calculations. The reef had immobilized the ship, but it had also created the perfect laboratory for human behavior. Isolation, scarcity, fear, and uncertainty combined to expose ambition, resentment, and latent cruelty. Cornelisz understood that, in this environment, the normal chains of authority were fragile. Power could be seized if one were patient, cunning, and ruthless. The first fractures were subtle. Sailors complained about rations, pointing fingers at those who appeared to hoard food or receive preferential treatment. Officers struggled to maintain discipline, their authority under constant negotiation with fatigue, hunger, and fear. Rumors circulated of hidden stores, of favoritism, of mismanagement. Every dispute, however minor, became a test of loyalty and courage. Cornelisz listened carefully, offering small words of sympathy, subtle gestures of alliance, positioning himself as both confidant and strategist. He began to quietly sow doubt. If the current leadership could not protect them, if provisions ran out, then who would decide their fate? Over time, his influence expanded. Men, exhausted and desperate, sought direction, someone to articulate the tension that hung over every decision. Cornelisz provided it, framing fear as logic, necessity as justification. He argued, softly yet persuasively, that survival required decisive action, that patience was a dangerous illusion. He implied that those who hesitated or obeyed blindly risked death. Slowly, he built a cadre of followers, men attuned to opportunity, willing to embrace risk, and capable of violence if necessary. The reef, the ship, and isolation had created fertile ground for this seed of mutiny. The reef amplified tension beyond Cornelisz's control. The ship's precarious position meant that every misstep could provoke disaster. A loose rope, shifting cargo, or sudden lurch of the hull could kill. Fear had already sharpened instincts, and men were quick to act on suspicion or self-preservation. Cornelisz leveraged this instinct, framing doubts and grievances as shared injustice, giving followers a purpose beyond mere survival. Ambition intertwined with necessity, and the subtle currents of loyalty and resentment began to form a storm invisible to those who still clung to routine or discipline. As the mutiny solidified, the officers attempted to maintain order. They enforced rations, assigned duties, and directed repairs with discipline and urgency. Yet their authority was eroding. Men whispered behind their backs, performed tasks only partially, and watched for opportunities to subvert command. The reef had immobilized the ship physically, but human ambition was now immobilized only by restraint and fear of reprisal. Every command issued was tested by skepticism, every order met with hesitation, every glance a question of loyalty. The Batavia had become a crucible for human behavior, and Cornelisz had learned its alchemy. Fear was the tool, but it was ambition that gave it power. Cornelisz observed which men were strong, which were desperate, which would follow, and which would resist. He noted rivalries and weaknesses, knowing that fractures would become weapons. Disputes over rations, cargo, and duties were amplified and framed as injustice, planting the seeds of resentment. Some sailors were eager for leadership, others were cautious, suspicious, or too exhausted to resist. Cornelisz identified potential allies, enemies, and neutrals, positioning himself as the one with foresight, strategy, and ruthlessness to navigate the chaos. Plans began to take shape. Cornelisz and his followers discussed in hushed tones the inevitability of action, debating timing, methods, and targets. The reef and the immobilized ship were both cage and stage. They could not escape, but neither could authority fully enforce order. Cornelisz realized that human weakness could be exploited systematically. Those who resisted, hesitated, or doubted could be isolated, coerced, or eliminated. Necessity, he argued internally, justified action. The weak threatened the survival of the strong. In this logic, fear became instrument, and survival a rationale for atrocity. The ordinary routines of the ship now carried an undercurrent of terror. Sailors performed tasks with caution, aware that observation could have consequences. Officers enforced orders with growing anxiety, sensing, but not yet understanding, the subtle erosion of control. Conversations were measured, alliances observed, and movements calculated. The reef, the damaged ship, and scarcity had created the perfect conditions. Isolation intensified observation, fear sharpened attention, and ambition sought opportunity. Cornelisz's network, quiet and invisible, began to control the psychological landscape of the Batavia. By the third day after the reef strike, the first acts of aggression were committed. Minor disputes over rations escalated into physical confrontations. Followers of Cornelisz tested boundaries, intimidating weaker sailors, challenging authority, and observing reactions. Each small act reinforced the perception of power, that the normal structures of command could be subverted if one were cunning, bold, and ruthless. Fear began to dominate, not just as response to danger, but as a deliberate tool of manipulation. The hierarchy that had maintained order aboard the Batavia was beginning to dissolve, replaced by a fragile, shifting alliance defined by ambition, desperation, and the latent threat of violence. Cornelisz's strategy was meticulous. He positioned men to observe potential opponents, to spread rumors of incompetence or betrayal, and to quietly eliminate those who could challenge him. Every whisper, every subtle action, every observation contributed to a network of influence that extended from the upper decks to the lower holds. The reef had immobilized the ship physically, but human ambition had found a way to dominate the moral and social structure. The Batavia was no longer merely a vessel. It had become a stage where power, fear, and survival intertwined with lethal consequence. Even the officers' attempts to maintain routine were compromised. Assignments were executed reluctantly, inspections became perfunctory, and trust eroded with every misstep. Sailors, exhausted and desperate, began to rely on Cornelisz for guidance, protection, and explanation. The psychological hold was almost complete. Ambition, once dormant, now merged with necessity, and the first acts of mutiny, the subtle manipulation of fear, loyalty, and obedience, were already manifesting in daily behavior. By nightfall, the ship seemed transformed. The reef held the Batavia in place, the damaged hull groaned with every wave, and the survivors' world had shifted from routine labor to psychological battlefield. Fear and ambition intertwined, and Cornelisz had established a network of influence that threatened to fracture the remaining structure of order. Every sailor, officer, and follower was now a participant, willingly or not, in a tense, invisible negotiation of power. The stage was set, the players identified, and the first whispers of violence had already taken root in the hearts of men pushed beyond ordinary limits. The reef had immobilized the ship, but human nature had seized the opportunity to move freely, unchecked. Ambition, necessity, and cunning combined to form the first sparks of mutiny. The Batavia had transformed from a vessel of trade and ambition into a crucible of fear, observation, and latent violence, where survival would demand not only endurance, but vigilance, loyalty, and the willingness to confront the worst instincts in oneself and others. The Batavia rested on the reef, crippled and immovable, while the survivors faced a new horizon, land, barren, remote, and deceptive. The crew's first attempts to reach it were cautious, desperate, and revealing. Small boats were lowered, planks tested, and the shallow channels navigated with meticulous care, yet every step carried danger. The reef had saved them from immediate drowning, but it had also delivered them into the hands of the island and of each other. Isolation intensified every tension, every fear, and every ambition. Men who had once obeyed orders without question now acted with subtle defiance. Cornelisz's network had hardened, and the seeds of mutiny began to bear fruit. Those who feared or mistrusted the officers turned toward him for guidance. Decisions that were once communal became dictated by the promise of survival, by the cunning calculation of who would dominate, who would protect, and who would be sacrificed. The reef had immobilized the ship. Now, the island would provide a stage for ambition, cruelty, and human error to collide. The landing itself was a trial. Waves lapped aggressively against the hulls of small boats, threatening to capsize them. Men slipped on slimy rocks and coral, boots scraping against sharp surfaces, hands raw from clinging to planks and each other. Even those who reached the shore were exhausted, sunburned, and drenched, their bodies protesting every movement. The island, deceptively serene, offered no shelter and little promise of comfort. Its sands were hot, rocks jagged, and brush thick. Every breath was heavy with salt and exertion, and every step a negotiation between will and weakness. Once ashore, Cornelisz acted with deliberate calculation. He had watched, waited, and selected his allies carefully. Those he identified as weak, dissenting, or inconvenient were marked quietly, their influence marginalized, or their fates whispered as inevitable. Fear was now the instrument of control, wielded with precision. Some men clung desperately to familiar authority, the officers and ship's hierarchy, but their power was compromised by exhaustion, scarcity, and isolation. Cornelisz exploited this imbalance with calm, measured ruthlessness. The first acts of violence were surgical, terrifying in their simplicity. Sailors who resisted his authority or challenged his plans disappeared quietly at first, removed from the island by small boats under cover of darkness, or bound and confined with threatening words. Rumors spread swiftly, men vanished, others were coerced, and the psychological grip tightened. Those remaining began to assess risk, to measure loyalty, to negotiate survival in a calculus of fear. The reef had immobilized the Batavia. The island immobilized morality, exposing the darker instincts of men under extreme duress. Provisions were now a source of immediate tension. Freshwater pools on the island were small, uncertain, and difficult to access. Food was scarce. Coconuts, shellfish, and what few supplies could be salvaged from the ship. Cornelisz leveraged scarcity as a tool, distributing resources selectively, rewarding obedience, and punishing dissent. Every meal became a negotiation, every ration a statement of power. Hunger sharpened instincts, weakened judgment, and forced men to confront the choice between compliance and survival. Fear had become currency, ambition its inevitable companion. The officers attempted to reassert control, organizing work parties to gather food, maintain shelters, and manage the wounded. Yet their authority was fragile. Each order met with subtle hesitation, each command tested by fear, each instruction interpreted through the lens of survival and the growing shadow of mutiny. Cornelisz and his followers observed meticulously, encouraging minor insubordination, amplifying distrust, and gradually consolidating psychological dominance over the men stranded ashore. Tension escalated as the days passed. Isolation, combined with exposure, fatigue, and fear, to erode solidarity. Small disputes over water, shade, and space became flashpoints for aggression. Words turned to threats. Threats turned to coercion. Cornelisz orchestrated these interactions with cold calculation, ensuring that resistance was costly and compliance rewarded. Men learned quickly that survival depended not solely on strength or skill, but on reading the psychological landscape he had created, measuring risk, and aligning, however reluctantly, with the new order. Above all, the island amplified uncertainty. The reef had trapped the ship. The surrounding waters offered no reassurance. Every sound carried danger, waves crashing against rocks, birds overhead, or whispers of movement in the brush. Nightfall was oppressive. Shadows stretched long, across sand and scrub, blending with the fear in men's eyes. Fires were lit in cautious patterns, designed to provide warmth and light, but not reveal positions to potential adversaries. Sleep was fitful. The constant awareness of unseen threats, the reef, the water, the men themselves, gnawed at nerves. Every breath, every movement, every glance was weighed for potential consequences. Cornelis's influence reached every corner of this fragile society. He had identified which men could be manipulated, which could be intimidated, and which would follow blindly. He controlled information, allocating knowledge strategically about water sources, about the location of supplies, and about the movements of officers. The reef and the island were now instruments, shaping human behavior with brutal precision. Fear became a language, obedience a currency, and survival a constant negotiation under his watchful eye. Amid this environment, the first larger-scale violence began. Groups loyal to Cornelisz patrolled the island, seeking out dissenters or those deemed weak. Attacks were swift, decisive, and shocking. Sailors were killed or intimidated into submission. Rumors spread like wildfire, magnifying terror. The officers attempted to intervene, but were undermined at every turn. Those who sought to maintain order discovered that courage alone could not override fear, and the very hierarchy that had structured life at sea was unraveling in the crucible of the reef and island. By the third day ashore, the Batavia had become more than a wreck. It was a psychological battlefield, a theater of survival and cruelty, where ambition, fear, and human instinct played out with devastating effect. Cornelis's authority was growing, his network of followers consolidated, and the officers' influence waned. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear had reshaped loyalty, eroded morality, and created an environment where violence was not only possible, but inevitable. The reef had immobilized the ship. The island had immobilized reason. Survival demanded adaptation, vigilance, and acceptance of the cruel new order. Even the natural world contributed to tension. The sun beat relentlessly, sunburn and dehydration sapping strength. Rainstorms soaked men suddenly, leaving them chilled and vulnerable. Insects, sharp rocks, and thorny brush added constant irritation and threat. The ocean, visible from the shore, seemed vast and indifferent, a reminder that rescue was not guaranteed. Each wave, each gust of wind, each shifting shadow reinforced the fragility of human life and the dominance of circumstance over skill, courage, or morality. By nightfall, the island was silent except for the murmur of water against the reef, the crackle of isolated fires, and the whispered movements of men too frightened to sleep. Cornelish's influence was now pervasive. Obedience was measured, dissent punished, and fear weaponized. The Batavia's survivors had entered a world in which human nature, stripped bare by scarcity, isolation, and the pressures of survival, was exposed in its rawest, most dangerous form. The reef had immobilized the ship. The island had immobilized morality itself. The island was no longer merely a refuge. It had become a hunting ground. Cornelis's control over the men was now absolute, his influence extending through fear, coercion, and the meticulous orchestration of terror. The reef had trapped the Batavia, and the survivors had stepped ashore only to find that the threat of drowning had been replaced by a far more immediate danger: the deliberate, systematic persecution of anyone who defied or threatened Cornelis's fragile dominion. Each morning, the sun rose on a theater of dread, casting light on men who no longer dared to speak freely or move without caution. The first attacks were clinical. Cornelis's loyal followers patrolled the island in small, silent groups, scanning the brush and rocks for men deemed weak, hesitant, or disobedient. Victims were seized swiftly, bound, threatened, or removed from sight, sometimes never to return. The constant, unpredictable threat forced every man to consider every action carefully, to calculate the cost of defiance, to weigh survival against conscience. Fear became instinct, embedded in every glance, every whispered conversation, every choice to move or remain hidden. Above all, Cornelisz understood the power of uncertainty. The island itself was a weapon. Dense brush, jagged rocks, hidden pools, and uneven terrain made it impossible to track every movement. A man who thought himself safe could vanish in seconds, leaving whispers and panic in his wake. The reef, the Batavia, and the island together had created a crucible. No space was secure, no movement unobserved, no decision free from consequence. Survival required constant vigilance, patience, and an ability to suppress instinctive fear long enough to navigate the landscape of terror Cornelisz had orchestrated. The hunted adapted quickly. Some men attempted to hide in the denser brush or scale rocky outcrops, seeking vantage points from which they could observe Cornelisz's patrols. Others banded together, whispering plans for diversion or escape, testing the boundaries of the terror imposed upon them. Every action, however minor, carried immense risk. One misstep, an accidental sound, a visible shadow, a misjudged route, could expose them to violence. The island's geography, the reef beyond, and the relentless surveillance by Cornelisz's followers ensured that every breath taken was measured against danger, every heartbeat shadowed by fear. Cornelisz, ever calculating, reinforced his dominion with displays of cruelty designed to consolidate obedience. Public punishments were meted out to those who hesitated, who questioned, or who attempted to evade his authority. The psychological impact was immediate. The survivors learned that hesitation was dangerous, suspicion was a liability, and visibility could be fatal. Even the officers, struggling to maintain some semblance of command and morale, were forced to comply outwardly, knowing that challenge could provoke violence not just against themselves, but against the men under their nominal care. Scarcity amplified the terror. Water, food, and shelter remained limited. Cornelisz manipulated each resource with precision. Those who complied, who demonstrated loyalty or utility, received preferential access. Those who hesitated or questioned were deprived. The human calculus became simple and brutal. Survival demanded obedience. Hunger sharpened instincts. Exhaustion dulled judgment, and fear became the lingua franca of interaction. Every ration, every drop of water, every inch of shade became both a reward and a threat, a tool through which Cornelisz maintained dominance. The first killings were deliberate and terrifying. Men who attempted to resist, who questioned authority, or who sought to protect others were isolated and executed with cold precision. Cornelisz's followers moved with stealth, ensuring that each act reinforced the perception of absolute power. The island itself, once a neutral landscape of sand, rocks, and brush, became a stage for human cruelty. Trees, pools, and boulders provided cover for the hunted, but also amplified the horror, offering no true refuge from the reach of a calculated, ruthless leadership. Survivors learned quickly to suppress instinct. Flight and confrontation were equally dangerous. Obedience became both a shield and a compromise. Loyalty, a survival tactic rather than a moral choice. Every interaction, every glance, every word carried potential consequence. The reef had immobilized the Batavia. The island had immobilized morality. Fear and ambition intertwined, reshaping human behavior in ways that revealed both resourcefulness and depravity. Men calculated every movement, measured every act of speech, and constantly gauged the intentions of those around them, acutely aware that error could be fatal. Cornelisz exploited human relationships to maintain control. Friendships, alliances, and hierarchies formed in response to exhaustion and necessity were manipulated for strategic advantage. Misplaced trust or overt resistance could trigger swift punishment. Observers were everywhere, eyes peering from brush, shadows moving across rocks, the quiet approach of a loyal follower. Cornelisz understood that fear, amplified by scarcity and exposure, could become a precise instrument of governance. The survivors were no longer merely stranded. They were participants in a carefully engineered system of control, survival, and terror. The psychological strain was immense. Men huddled in the dark, exhausted from days of labor, evasion, and constant vigilance. Sleep became dangerous, unconsciousness a vulnerability. Hunger gnawed at concentration, and dehydration weakened both body and mind. Whispers of rebellion and escape circulated cautiously, yet even those who conceived plans understood that the island's geography, Cornelis's watchfulness, and the reef-bound Batavia limited options severely. Every decision was weighed for immediate consequence, every action a calculation in a deadly shifting equation. Violence escalated with efficiency and precision. Cornelisz and his followers learned which men could be manipulated, which could be coerced, and which would resist. Each act of aggression reinforced obedience among the rest. Fear was both deterrent and motivator. Men complied not from loyalty, nor from respect for authority, but from the instinct to survive, sharpened by exhaustion, deprivation, and the constant reminder of mortality. The reef had claimed the ship. The island claimed the minds of men. Survival depended on vigilance, strategy, and willingness to suppress instinctive moral or ethical impulses. By the fourth day, the survivors' world had transformed entirely. The island, once a mere refuge, was now a battlefield of power and terror. Cornelisz's network had expanded. Obedience, fear, and manipulation dictated movement, decision-making, and interaction. Officers attempted intervention but were largely powerless, constrained by exhaustion, scarcity, and the pervasive influence of fear. The hunted learned to navigate a delicate balance, to move cautiously, avoid attention, and survive long enough for potential rescue. The reef and the island, combined with human ambition and cruelty, had created an ecosystem of terror. Even the natural world contributed to unease. Tides shifted unpredictably, wind gusts threatened balance in makeshift shelters, and sudden storms added physical danger to the psychological torment. The survivors were trapped not only by geography, but by the orchestrated terror of Cornelisz's regime. Every sound, crashing waves, rustling leaves, snapping branches, triggered tension. Every shadow, every movement became a potential threat. Survival demanded not only endurance, but observation, calculation, and a willingness to negotiate the extremes of human behavior. By nightfall, the island was transformed. Fires flickered cautiously across the sand, shadows stretched long over rocks, and every sound carried meaning. Cornelisz's control was pervasive, absolute in its psychological reach, and brutal in its execution. The survivors were no longer merely seeking shelter or food. They were navigating a system of fear, deception, and calculated violence. The reef had immobilized the Batavia, but the island had immobilized morality. Every breath, every movement, and every choice was shadowed by the constant threat of death at the hands of man rather than nature. The reef held the Batavia fast, a silent testament to the ocean's indifferent power, while the island had become a stage for human ambition twisted by fear and scarcity. Officers and loyal sailors, still clinging to the remnants of order, surveyed their fractured world with grim determination. Their authority, once clear and unquestioned, now collided with the cunning, ruthless hierarchy that Cornelisz had erected. The gap between leadership by right and leadership by terror widened daily, and with it, the stakes for every decision increased. The first challenge was morale. Men huddled in the dense brush or along rocky outcrops, weary, sunburned, and hungry. Whispers circulated of betrayals, disappearances, and the growing influence of Cornelisz. Officers convened in secret, voices low but urgent. They knew that survival demanded action, yet action carried risk. Any misstep could expose them to immediate reprisal, while hesitation risked allowing Cornelisz to tighten his grip. Leadership required both courage and calculation, a delicate negotiation between authority, fear, and the fragile loyalty of those who still followed orders. Water and food remained scarce. Officers attempted to ration supplies, organize foraging parties, and establish temporary shelters. But each initiative was complicated by fear of Cornelisz's spies, by exhaustion, and by the unpredictable behavior of men pressed beyond ordinary limits. One small misallocation could provoke panic, rebellion, or violence. Every decision had to be precise, every command measured, yet even the most cautious planning carried risk. The survivors understood that scarcity amplified not only hunger, but mistrust, and that human nature under duress could turn allies into adversaries in a single desperate moment. Betrayal, subtle at first, began to surface. Sailors whispered to Cornelisz, relaying the movements and intentions of officers. Others feigned obedience while privately planning defiance, unsure whom to trust. The Reef had immobilized the Batavia. The island had immobilized certainty. Leadership was no longer merely a matter of issuing commands. It required constant assessment of loyalty, observation of behavior, and anticipation of treachery. Officers, accustomed to the clear chain of command at sea, found themselves navigating an environment in which every choice could provoke retaliation, sabotage, or death. Cornelisz, ever vigilant, exploited these fractures with precision. He encouraged doubt, amplified disputes, and manipulated perception. Small acts of disobedience were punished publicly, reinforcing the climate of fear. Allies were rewarded selectively, loyalty incentivized with rations, protection, or information. Every interaction became a calculated maneuver, and the officers' attempts at maintaining cohesion were subtly undermined. Fear, scarcity, and isolation had transformed simple obedience into a complex negotiation of survival, and the officers' authority was tested at every turn. The officers recognized that survival demanded both strategic thinking and courage. They began to meet clandestinely, formulating plans to regain control, protect the vulnerable, and counter Cornelisz's influence. Every plan was weighed against risk. Exposure could mean death, but inaction would allow the mutiny to consolidate. Decisions had to consider human psychology as much as physical danger, for the enemy was not only Cornelisz, but the corrosive effect of fear, exhaustion, and desperation on the men they sought to lead. Leadership now required understanding the latent potential for both loyalty and treachery in every man. Attempts to organize escape or resistance were perilous. Small parties would gather supplies, construct shelters, and test the terrain, all under the watchful eyes of Cornelisz's loyalists. Coordination required secrecy, timing, and trust, yet trust was scarce. Each man's behavior was constantly scrutinized, and misjudgment could result in immediate violence. The officers learned that leadership demanded not only courage and decisiveness, but also acute observation, psychological insight, and the ability to anticipate betrayal in a world reshaped by fear and scarcity. Tensions escalated as days passed. Cornelisz continued to assert control, demonstrating that compliance brought temporary safety while defiance brought peril. Officers faced a constant dilemma: act openly and risk immediate reprisal, or act covertly and hope for an opportunity to regain control. The Reef and island had immobilized the Batavia physically, but human nature had created an equally unyielding trap where every choice was weighed against consequence, and morality was tested by necessity, ambition, and fear. The officers' covert leadership began to bear fruit. Small victories were achieved, hidden caches of water and food were secured, loyal sailors coordinated movements to avoid Cornelisz's surveillance, and subtle acts of sabotage disrupted his control. Each success was tentative, fragile, yet essential. Morale, though strained, began to flicker with cautious hope. Leadership under these extreme conditions required a combination of authority, ingenuity, and moral clarity, and even these qualities could be undone by a single act of betrayal. Yet betrayal continued to shadow every action. Cornelis's network remained vigilant, ready to exploit hesitation or weakness. Misplaced trust, poorly timed action, or unobserved defiance could trigger immediate and lethal consequences. Officers weighed each decision carefully, understanding that courage alone was insufficient. Survival required tactical foresight, psychological insight, and precise coordination. The reef had immobilized the ship. The island had immobilized certainty. Leadership in this environment demanded constant vigilance, adaptability, and an unflinching understanding of human nature. As the days wore on, the officers became adept at balancing overt and covert leadership. Publicly, they maintained compliance, issuing orders that reinforced survival routines, while privately coordinating with loyal men to counter Cornelisz's influence. They leveraged scarcity strategically, directed work parties subtly, and used observation to identify potential threats or opportunities. Each action was a negotiation with both circumstance and human psychology. The reef, the damaged ship, and the island had created a world in which leadership required not only authority, but the ability to read, anticipate, and manipulate human behavior without inviting lethal reprisal. Nightfall brought tension that was almost tangible. Shadows lengthened across sand and rocks. Fires flickered with uncertain light, and every sound carried potential danger. The slap of waves, the rustle of brush, the whisper of a footstep. Officers used the cover of darkness to meet with loyal men, plan movements, and allocate resources carefully. Every word, every gesture, every calculation was measured, for mistakes could cost life and unravel the fragile equilibrium of order and survival. The reef had immobilized the Batavia. The island had immobilized certainty. Leadership now meant constant negotiation with fear, loyalty, and ambition. By the fifth day ashore, the officers understood the full extent of their predicament. Cornelis's influence was pervasive, but not absolute. Loyalty could still be cultivated, courage could still be directed, and survival could still be negotiated. Yet each action carried risk. Every decision demanded vigilance, and the psychological strain of isolation, scarcity, and terror weighed heavily on every man. Leadership had become a high-stakes exercise in observation, coordination, and courage, where betrayal lurked in every shadow, and survival demanded both moral clarity and tactical acumen. The reef had immobilized the ship, the island had immobilized morality, and Cornelisz had immobilized obedience. Officers were now forced to navigate a world in which human ambition, fear, and desperation dictated action and consequence. Every choice was a potential pivot between survival and death, loyalty and betrayal, courage and folly. Leadership was no longer merely a matter of rank or authority. It was a continuous exercise in perception, strategy, and endurance, with the lives of men balanced precariously on the edge of ambition and terror. The Batavia's reef-bound hull groaned under the relentless sun, and the island's scrub and jagged rocks reflected the harsh, unrelenting light. Yet it was human ambition and fear, not the ocean or the coral, that now dominated the survivors' world. Cornelis's influence had evolved from subtle manipulation to outright terror. The first disappearances had sown fear. Now, systematic violence ensured that every act of hesitation, doubt, or defiance carried a lethal consequence. The island had become a theater of bloodshed, and every man, whether officer, sailor, or mutineer, played a role in the unfolding horror. The officers, still clinging to authority, recognized that decisive action was necessary to preserve what remained of their command and to protect the weaker men. They convened in the shadowed interior of the wrecked Batavia, voices low but urgent, coordinating discreet movements and securing loyal sailors. Every word was measured, every plan considered against the knowledge that Cornelis's eyes and ears extended across the island. Exposure meant death, inaction meant submission. Leadership had become a constant calculation of risk, strategy, and human psychology, each choice carrying potential consequence for life or death. Cornelisz, aware of the officer's tentative organization, intensified his control. His loyal followers patrolled the island with ruthless precision, seeking out dissenters, isolated men, and anyone deemed a threat. The first killings of this stage were brutal. Men seized in hidden groves, bound and executed silently, bodies left as warnings to others. Fear, now weaponized, spread like wildfire. Survival required more than skill or courage. It demanded obedience, careful observation, and the willingness to navigate moral compromise. Every interaction, every glance, every choice was evaluated for its potential to provoke danger. The island's geography amplified terror. Dense brush, sharp rocks, and uneven terrain offered limited shelter, but also isolated men, leaving them vulnerable. Small groups moved cautiously, whispering, scanning, calculating. Those who sought to evade Cornelisz's loyalists found themselves navigating a deadly labyrinth, where the misplacement of a footstep or the rustle of a branch could signal their presence. The reef beyond limited escape, and the Batavia remained immobilized, a constant reminder of both past disaster and present peril. Survival became an exercise in both cunning and endurance, a delicate balance between observation and action. The first major confrontation was ignited by a whispered plan among loyal sailors. Hidden caches of provisions, previously secured, had been discovered by mutineers. Tension erupted as groups confronted each other over rations, words escalating to threats and then to violence. Cornelisz's followers responded swiftly and lethally. Men were overpowered, bound, and executed without hesitation, their screams echoing across the sand and rocks. Officers intervened where possible, yet their small numbers and exhaustion limited effectiveness. The balance of power was shifting, but fear remained the dominant force, a shadow that controlled movement and thought alike. Deception became a critical tool on both sides. Officers feigned compliance while coordinating with loyal sailors, moving under cover of night, using the terrain and hidden observation points to gather intelligence. Cornelisz's followers relied on intimidation, surprise, and calculated displays of cruelty to maintain control. Every action was part of an ongoing negotiation between survival and strategy. Every decision carried immediate consequence, whether in life, death, or psychological trauma. The reef had immobilized the Batavia, the island had immobilized morality, leaving human cunning and brutality as the only forces shaping survival. The psychological toll intensified rapidly. Exhaustion, hunger, and fear eroded rational thought. Men trembled under the constant threat of violence, and even those confident in loyalty questioned every motive, every instruction, every alliance. Trust was scarce. Betrayal seemed inevitable. Officers struggled to maintain morale while simultaneously defending against the encroaching influence of Cornelisz. Every interaction became a test of patience, judgment, and resilience. The human capacity to endure was being pushed to its limits, and the island, reef, and mutiny combined to form a crucible that revealed both courage and cruelty in stark relief. By the second day of open conflict, the scale of the bloodshed became apparent. Small groups moved like predators across the island, hunting dissenters, isolating men, and executing with meticulous, chilling efficiency. Officers attempted coordinated resistance, but the fractured state of the crew and the psychological dominance of Cornelisz' network limited their effectiveness. Every man on the island was acutely aware that a single error, an observed movement, a misinterpreted word, a moment of hesitation, could result in immediate death. Survival demanded constant vigilance, calculated action, and suppression of fear's instinctive impulses. Amid the chaos, Cornelisz demonstrated a strategic mind as lethal as it was manipulative. He orchestrated killings to maximize fear, consolidate loyalty, and eliminate potential threats before they could organize. Every act of violence served multiple purposes: a warning, a method of control, and a reinforcement of hierarchy within his faction. The officers and loyal sailors understood the stakes. Any attempt to intervene or protect others had to be precise, covert, and immediate. The reef and island together created a world in which every action carried amplified consequence, where moral choice was a luxury few could afford. By the third day, the Batavia survivors were divided into factions, those loyal to the officers, those subservient to Cornelisz, and the silent majority trapped between fear, indecision, and survival instinct. Each man navigated a landscape of uncertainty, measuring every word, movement, and glance against potential threat. The reef immobilized their ship. The island immobilized trust and morality. Violence had become both instrument and deterrent, a tool wielded by Cornelisz, and an omnipresent reminder of human fragility under extreme duress. As the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows lengthened across the island, fires flickering uncertainly over sand and brush. The officers moved cautiously, coordinating the next steps to protect the loyal, gather intelligence, and attempt to regain influence. Cornelish's followers patrolled with lethal precision, and even the most cautious sailors could not predict when an act of defiance would provoke immediate, deadly reprisal. Every breath, every movement, every whispered word carried risk. The island, the reef, and the human mind had become instruments of terror, shaping behavior with relentless subtlety. By nightfall, the scale of betrayal and bloodshed had reshaped the survivors' world. The reef had immobilized the Batavia physically, but the island had immobilized morality, exposing fear, ambition, and cruelty in every corner of human experience. Cornelisz's psychological control was near absolute. Officers maintained only the faintest thread of loyalty and organization, and the remaining survivors were caught in a delicate balance between obedience, deception, and survival. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, where cunning, courage, and brutality would collide, and where human endurance would be tested to its limits. The island lay under a brooding sun, its sand and brush stretching outward as if mocking the men stranded upon it. The reef still held the Batavia fast, a silent monument to the ocean's indifference, yet it was human design and determination that had transformed this place into a crucible. Officers and loyal sailors had watched the progression of Cornelisz's terror with growing apprehension, their calculations sharpened by exhaustion, hunger, and the constant, unpredictable threat of violence. Survival demanded more than endurance. It demanded action precise enough to restore control without inviting immediate reprisal. They began in secrecy, selecting small, trusted groups to survey the terrain, collect hidden provisions, and assess the movements of Cornelisz's followers. Every decision required careful observation. The slightest misstep could expose them to detection and death. Officers used the wrecked Batavia as both command center and sanctuary, holding clandestine meetings in darkened cabins where whispers carried only as far as the walls themselves. Loyalty was fragile, and even among the men they trusted, vigilance was paramount. Each participant understood that hesitation could cost life and compromise the entire strategy. Resources were scant. Water from small pools, coconuts, and shellfish became essential rations. Officers coordinated foraging parties, but every trip beyond the immediate shelter was a negotiation with danger. Cornelis's network was vigilant, patrolling in unpredictable patterns, observing movements, and ready to punish deviation. Every act of gathering food or assessing terrain demanded stealth, timing, and psychological acumen. Survival was no longer determined solely by physical endurance. It depended on understanding the minds of those who wielded power and fear with calculated precision. The first countermeasures were subtle. Officers arranged diversions to distract Cornelis's followers, sending small groups to one sector, while moving others under cover of brush to fortify positions or gather intelligence. Each maneuver was choreographed to minimize exposure while maximizing psychological effect. The island, which had previously served as a hunting ground for the mutineers, now became a terrain for tactical initiative. Every step, every placement of men, and every sound carried meaning. Observation and timing were as crucial as courage. Misjudgment could render all planning moot. Morale, fragile yet persistent, became both a weapon and a necessity. Officers communicated hope where possible, providing small successes, a hidden cache secured, a patrol avoided, a brief respite from harassment, as reinforcement for continued loyalty. Fear remained pervasive, but these gestures reminded the men that survival could be managed through skill, observation, and careful action. The psychological dimension of leadership became paramount. Courage alone was insufficient. Every choice had to be justified, not only strategically, but also morally, maintaining cohesion under relentless pressure. Cornelisz, aware of the subtle resistance, adjusted his strategies. Patrols became more frequent, intimidation more public, and acts of violence more visible. Yet even he had underestimated the resilience of the officers and their loyal sailors. The island's geography, previously exploited for terror, now offered opportunities. Hidden depressions in the sand, brush, and rocky outcrops became positions for observation, ambush, and communication. Officers and loyalists used these advantages to move with caution, coordinating in silence, anticipating threats, and exploiting every lapse in the mutineers' vigilance. The first direct confrontation emerged unexpectedly. A small group of Cornelis's men attempted to seize a hidden cache, unaware that officers had anticipated this movement. The encounter was brief but decisive. Loyal sailors, prepared and positioned, managed to repel the attackers, demonstrating that careful planning, observation, and courage could disrupt the mutiny's momentum. Fear remained potent, yet this success infused officers and loyal men with renewed determination. Even the smallest victories had outsized psychological effect, showing that calculated action could restore some measure of agency in a world dominated by terror. Every day became a balancing act between overt survival and covert resistance. Officers monitored behavior, identified potential threats, and reinforced loyalty among the men willing to act with discipline and caution. The Reef anchored the Batavia, preventing escape, while the island's rugged terrain magnified danger and opportunity alike. Each patrol, each gathering of food, each movement across sand and rocks required precision, foresight, and the coordination of small, discrete groups. Success depended not merely on courage or strength, but on understanding the interplay of fear, ambition, and opportunity among both allies and enemies. Psychological pressure remained constant. The mutineers' displays of violence ensured that the majority of men moved cautiously, hesitant to challenge authority outright. Officers had to exploit fear without provoking retaliatory attacks, a delicate equilibrium in which miscalculation could mean death. Observation became paramount. Even the faintest shift in body language, a whispered conversation, or a subtle misstep could reveal plans, expose hidden resources, or invite lethal confrontation. Survival was a test of intelligence, patience, and timing. as much as endurance or courage. By the fourth day, officers had established a network of communication and observation sufficient to plan larger interventions. Small parties moved under the cover of terrain, observing Cornelisz's movements, noting his patrol patterns, and mapping opportunities for both supply gathering and tactical disruption. Each movement was deliberate, minimizing exposure while maximizing control over outcomes. The Reef had immobilized the ship. The island, once a theater of fear, now offered avenues for careful, calculated initiative. Survival was no longer merely reactive. It had become an active negotiation with both geography and human behavior. The stakes escalated as officers considered more aggressive measures. Cornelisz's network remained formidable, capable of swift, lethal response, yet officers recognized that decisive, carefully planned action could disrupt the mutiny. Coordination between loyal sailors became a fine art, balancing secrecy, timing, and psychological insight. Every decision was informed by observation, every movement calculated, and every interaction scrutinized. Leadership required adaptability, courage, and precise judgment. Miscalculation could undo the most careful planning and cost lives in an instant. By nightfall, the survivors had achieved a delicate equilibrium. Officers maintained covert control over loyal men, provisions had been gathered discreetly, and Cornelisz's attention was partially diverted by the controlled disruptions of these small, calculated interventions. Fear remained pervasive, violence was never far, and scarcity continued to press upon the survivors. Yet even amid exhaustion, hunger, and constant threat, the officers' careful planning had demonstrated the possibility of regaining agency in a landscape dominated by terror and ambition. The Reef held the Batavia. The island held both peril and opportunity. Human determination and intelligence now defined the edge between survival and annihilation. The island, once a stage for terror, had become a proving ground. Officers and loyal sailors had learned to move in shadows, observe without exposure, and act decisively when opportunity arose. The Reef immobilized their ship physically, but the careful, deliberate strategies of leadership allowed the survivors to navigate the lethal human terrain around them. Cornelisz's influence, while still pervasive, faced its first true challenges. Survival now depended not merely on enduring fear and scarcity, but on exploiting knowledge, observation, and human psychology with precision and courage. The island stretched before the survivors, its brush and jagged rocks no longer merely obstacles, but battlegrounds where courage, calculation, and desperation converged. The Reef held the Batavia firmly, a reminder of the forces beyond human control, yet human ambition, fear, and ruthlessness now defined the immediate world. Officers and loyal sailors, their nerves honed by days of observation, deprivation, and subtle defiance, prepared to confront Cornelisz and his followers directly. The time for whispers, diversions, and cautious planning had passed. The moment demanded decisive action, executed with precision and courage. The sun rose, harsh and relentless, illuminating sand and rock, casting long shadows across the uneven terrain. Officers gathered their loyal men, instructing them in measured silence. Every gesture, every whispered word carried weight. Movement had to be coordinated. Hesitation could be fatal. Cornelisz's network was still formidable, and the mutineers' influence pervasive, yet the officers' careful observation and strategic patience had exposed weaknesses, small gaps in patrols, predictable routines, and overconfidence. These would be exploited. The island, once a trap, had become the stage for human cunning and deliberate resistance. The first act of confrontation was subtle but deliberate. Small parties approached patrols of Cornelisz's followers, using the cover of brush and the contours of the land to avoid detection. Observation allowed the officers to identify key positions and leadership figures among the mutineers. Every action was calculated. One misstep, one premature exposure could trigger violent reprisal and unravel the fragile plan. The reef anchored the Batavia. The island shaped the strategy. Survival, after days of terror, depended not merely on courage or strength, but on timing, precision, and the ability to manipulate fear and perception. Cornelisz sensed the shift. His spies reported unusual movements, whispered discussions, and small diversions. He reacted with increased patrols, displays of intimidation, and heightened vigilance. Yet his attention, divided across multiple sectors of the island, could not entirely suppress the officers' coordinated efforts. The balance of fear and opportunity had begun to tilt. Every step, every hidden movement, every quietly executed plan carried heightened significance. The island's geography, which had previously favored terror and control, now offered possibilities for observation, maneuver, and confrontation. The first skirmish erupted near a small clearing where officers attempted to secure a cache of water and food. Cornelish's followers, moving swiftly to intercept, found themselves countered by men positioned in hidden depressions and behind scrub. The clash was sudden and violent, yet disciplined, with officers directing loyal sailors with careful signals. Fear surged in every man's chest, yet training, observation, and a clear understanding of stakes guided each action. Every movement had consequence, every decision a potential pivot between life and death. The reef immobilized the Batavia, the island immobilized certainty, courage, cunning, and calculation dictated survival. Violence escalated rapidly. Cornelisz's followers, initially confident, began to falter as officers exploited gaps, miscalculations, and overextension. Each skirmish, though small in scale, carried immense psychological weight. Men who had once obeyed blindly began to hesitate, question, and in some cases switch allegiance. Fear remained pervasive, yet now mingled with recognition that the officers' careful planning could alter the balance of power. Observation, timing, and decisiveness became the instruments through which human survival, loyalty, and morality were tested under extreme conditions. The reef-bound Batavia served as both refuge and stage. Officers used its cabins and partially submerged decks to coordinate, direct movements, and conceal small contingents. Cornelish's network, though vigilant, could not fully anticipate these hidden maneuvers. The island's terrain, rugged and uneven, allowed officers to exploit elevation, cover, and observation points to control engagement zones. Every decision, whether to advance, hold position, or withdraw, was calculated against the psychological and physical state of both loyal sailors and mutineers. Survival now depended on exploiting knowledge, anticipation, and decisive action. As confrontation intensified, Cornelisz's ruthlessness became fully apparent. Attempts to isolate officers or loyal men were met with coordinated resistance. Skirmishes became lethal, swift, and precise, with casualties mounting on both sides. Men reacted with a mixture of fear, anger, and determination. The psychological landscape, fear of reprisal, hope for survival, and desire for justice shaped every choice. Even in moments of violence, observation and strategy remained paramount. A single mistake could reverse fortunes and result in death or capture. The officers' decisive action began to yield results. Loyal men, guided by careful planning and coordinated movement, disrupted patrols, secured provisions, and confined key mutineers. Cornelisz's influence, previously unchecked, now faced direct challenges. Fear, which had sustained obedience among the mutineers, now worked against them. Hesitation, miscommunication, and overconfidence exposed vulnerabilities. Every engagement reinforced the importance of timing, observation, and psychological insight as the fragile equilibrium of terror, control, and survival began to fracture. By the third day of confrontation, the island's landscape was scarred by violence. Fires burned in controlled areas to create both cover and distraction. Sand and rock bore the marks of movement, struggle, and fear. The reef remained a constant, indifferent witness to human conflict. Officers maintained coordination despite exhaustion, leveraging both terrain and careful psychological insight to exploit gaps in Cornelisz's control. Small victories accumulated, undermining the mutineers' cohesion and revealing the officers' capacity to restore order through calculated, decisive action. The culmination of this confrontation occurred as Cornelisz's influence fractured under pressure. Key followers, confronted with both lethal resistance and the opportunity for survival, began to defect, surrender, or hesitate. The officers seized these moments, consolidating loyal men, neutralizing threats, and securing control over strategic positions. Every decision, every movement, and every interaction carried enormous consequence. The reef had immobilized the Batavia. The island had immobilized morality. Yet skill, courage, and observation now dictated outcomes in the struggle for survival and authority. By nightfall, the final confrontation had tilted decisively. Cornelisz, isolated, with followers either neutralized or defected, confronted the reality that his dominion was collapsing. Officers and loyal sailors, exhausted but resolute, had regained significant control, restoring a measure of authority and security to the survivors. Fear persisted, yet now it was tempered by the knowledge that deliberate action, observation, and calculated courage could prevail even under extreme conditions. The reef remained unmoved, the island unchanged, yet the human landscape had shifted. Loyalty, strategy, and endurance had reshaped survival. The island, once a theater of terror and relentless pursuit, now lay heavy with silence. Fires burned low, their smoke drifting into the hot, oppressive air, carrying with it the scent of sand, salt, and blood. The reef still cradled the Batavia, immovable and indifferent, a monument to misfortune, yet the island itself had become a witness to the extremes of human ambition, cruelty, and survival. Officers and loyal sailors moved cautiously among the survivors, assessing the toll, securing the living, and accounting for the dead. The aftermath was as complex as the violence that had preceded it, a landscape of both relief and deep, unspoken trauma. Cornelisz, once a figure of absolute terror, had been captured. He was restrained, his followers neutralized, and the survivors now faced the grim task of restoring some measure of order. Yet, authority alone could not undo the psychological fractures that had spread through the crew. Men had seen friends executed, endured threats, and been forced to navigate moral compromises daily. Fear, mistrust, and grief weighed heavily upon every individual. Leadership now required not only coordination and protection, but also the careful management of despair, guilt, and uncertainty. The reef had immobilized the ship. The island had tested the very essence of humanity. Bodies were tended, where possible, and those who had fallen in the conflict were buried in shallow graves along the sand and scrub. The act was hurried, precise, and somber. There was little room for ceremony. Survival demanded efficiency even in the wake of carnage. Yet even in these somber tasks, the officers sought to restore structure, providing men with roles, responsibilities, and guidance. Each assignment, whether the tending of wounds, the distribution of food, or the oversight of shelter, became both a practical necessity and a tool to rebuild fractured confidence and cohesion. Human resilience, though battered, began to assert itself amid exhaustion and grief. Water and food remained critical concerns. The reef had prevented access to open ocean escape, and the island offered only sparse resources. Officers organized careful foraging, rationing, and salvage from the wrecked Batavia. Every resource was scrutinized, every drop of water and morsel of food accounted for, to prevent renewed scarcity from exacerbating fear or inciting further conflict. Men who had previously been at odds, either from fear or alignment with Cornelisz, now recognized the shared necessity of cooperation. Survival depended on both discipline and the cautious rebuilding of trust. Psychological recovery was uneven. Many survivors remained haunted by the horrors they had witnessed, the killings, the betrayals, the constant tension between life and death. Some withdrew into silence, eyes fixed on distant waves or the reef, as if seeking refuge in the immovable landscape. Others displayed bursts of anger, grief, or guilt, confronting the consequences of their actions or inactions. Officers understood that the process of restoration required both vigilance and patience, as men relearned how to trust, how to cooperate, and how to survive in a world where human cruelty had once dominated every moment. Cornelish's capture became a focal point for the survivor's sense of justice. He was restrained, observed, and brought under the authority of the officers, yet his presence remained a stark reminder of the fragile boundaries between order and chaos, leadership and tyranny. Discussion among officers and loyal sailors revolved not only around practical survival, but also the moral reckoning. How to address the man who had orchestrated terror, who had manipulated fear, and who had destroyed lives in pursuit of power. The reef had immobilized the ship. The island had exposed the depths of ambition and cruelty that men could wield against one another. The survivors also confronted the human cost of fear-driven compliance. Those who had acted under duress, those who had participated in violence or betrayals, faced guilt and fear for their own safety. Officers had to navigate these complexities, balancing accountability with the necessity of maintaining cohesion. Some men were reassigned to essential tasks, others confined under supervision, and all were closely observed for signs of renewed mutiny or instability. Leadership in the aftermath was as much about psychological management as it was about rationing food or securing shelter. As the days passed, the reef and the island remained constant, indifferent to human endeavor. The Batavia, battered but intact, held the wreckage of ambition, fear, and survival. Men moved cautiously, scavenging what could be salvaged from the ship, repairing small sections for shelter, and reinforcing areas for protection. Each day was measured not only in practical accomplishment, but also in psychological endurance. The officer's task was continuous, to balance authority with empathy, structure with necessity, and vigilance with restoration of trust. Communication among the survivors became essential. Officers implemented a system of watch rotations, reporting, and controlled movement, ensuring that men were accounted for and that resources were allocated fairly. Observation became a tool not of surveillance for fear, but of careful coordination, maintaining safety and reinforcing the fragile social order that had begun to reemerge. The reef immobilized the ship, the island immobilized certainty. Leadership now sought to stabilize human behavior through structure, accountability, and careful attention to both fear and morality. By the end of the first week following the confrontation, a tentative equilibrium had been established. Cornelish's influence was nullified. Mutineers were neutralized or surrendered. Officers and loyal sailors had restored partial order. Yet the human toll was evident in eyes, gestures, and quiet conversations. Survival had been secured, but at a price: exhaustion, trauma, and a deep understanding of the extremes to which fear and ambition could drive men. The reef remained steadfast, the island indifferent, yet human resilience, carefully cultivated, strategically guided, and hard-won, was beginning to assert itself in the wake of chaos. The final act of reckoning involved not only managing the survivors, but preparing for the eventual rescue or movement beyond the reef. Officers coordinated plans to signal passing ships, ration the remaining supplies, and maintain vigilance over both geography and human behavior. Every step was guided by lessons learned over the preceding days: observation, timing, calculation, and cautious trust. The reef had immobilized the ship. The island had revealed the fragile limits of morality and authority. Survival demanded both practical ingenuity and psychological insight. Men moved forward, tentative yet determined, navigating the aftermath with careful strategy and enduring vigilance. The island, once a stage for terror, had become a place of cautious restoration. Men who had witnessed the extremes of cruelty and ambition now confronted the possibility of survival, order, and return to human community. Officers guided, observed, and directed, their leadership now defined by both moral clarity and tactical competence. The reef anchored the Batavia, the island demanded constant attention, and human endurance, tested to the limit, began the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding life after terror. The horizon remained both a promise and a torment. Weeks of uncertainty had taught the survivors to measure every wind, every ripple of the sea, every shadow of clouds. The reef cradled the Batavia, immovable, indifferent, and yet its presence marked the limits of possibility. The island, once a theater of fear and human cruelty, now bore witness to exhaustion, resilience, and the painstaking reconstitution of order. Every survivor had been transformed, shaped by terror, hardened by scarcity, and tempered by moral compromise. Yet hope, fragile and tentative, stirred with the possibility of rescue. News arrived in the form of a distant sail, a faint line against the blue haze of the horizon. Officers moved swiftly, coordinating signals to attract attention. Fires were built in carefully chosen locations, their smoke rising in deliberate patterns, conveying both distress and presence. Men positioned themselves along the sand, weapons and tools at hand, ready for both welcome and defense. The reef, which had immobilized the Batavia, now served as both barrier and guide, channeling the approach of rescue while testing the survivors' ingenuity. Observation, timing, and disciplined action, lessons hard won through days of terror, became instruments of survival and redemption. The arrival of a ship sent a tremor through the survivors. Some reacted with relief, others with disbelief, and many with cautious vigilance, unable to let down the constant watchfulness that had become instinct. Officers coordinated the approach, ensuring that signals were visible, actions deliberate, and the fragile order maintained. Cornelisz remained restrained, his gaze cold, silent, and immovable, a living reminder of the human capacity for cruelty that had tested them all. The reef prevented immediate escape, requiring both ingenuity and careful maneuvering to transfer men safely to the approaching vessel. Rescue, when it arrived, was methodical and tense. Boats approached the reef, carrying officers and loyal sailors in careful rotations to secure the survivors, while others prepared for the containment of Cornelisz and his remaining followers. Every movement was deliberate. The survivors had learned the deadly consequences of haste, misjudgment, or exposure. The reef, indifferent to human urgency, complicated transfer, and even the act of boarding required coordination, observation, and careful timing. Men moved as if still navigating the deadly constraints of the island, their bodies conditioned by fear, exhaustion, and the lessons of survival. The process of evacuation revealed the depth of trauma among the survivors. Some moved with tentative relief, gratitude tempered by lingering fear. Others struggled, silent, haunted by the images of violence and betrayal that had defined their days on the island. Officers in short order, distributing responsibilities for assisting the injured, carrying supplies, and monitoring Cornelisz and his followers. Every gesture was measured, every decision weighed against the potential for panic or renewed conflict. The Reef had immobilized the Batavia, the island had immobilized certainty. The rescue required both discipline and attention to human frailty. Cornelish's fate was determined with equal precision. The officer in command of the rescue vessel recognized both the danger he posed and the need for accountability. Restraint, observation, and preparation ensured that the man who had orchestrated terror would be removed from the island without endangering the survivors further. The Reef had anchored him physically. Human ingenuity now constrained him morally and legally. The survivors watched, understanding both relief and the enduring shadow of his presence, aware that the consequences of ambition and cruelty would extend beyond the immediate rescue. The psychological toll of the ordeal remained evident even as the survivors left the island. The Reef receded behind them, the Batavia a silhouette against the sun, yet every man carried the weight of the mutiny, the violence, and the moral compromises demanded by survival. Officers responsible for both the planning of rescue and the continued safety of their men maintained careful oversight. Trust, fractured by fear and betrayal, required reconstruction through both observation and deliberate action. Every interaction during evacuation was shaped by the lessons of the island: vigilance, timing, and awareness of both human ambition and frailty. In the days following rescue, the survivors began to reconcile their experience with reality. Reports, testimonies, and accounts were recorded with meticulous attention to fact. Officers documented the sequence of events, the strategies employed, the acts of cruelty, and the responses that had preserved life. The Reef, the island, and the wrecked Batavia served as a backdrop to human endurance, ingenuity, and the perilous consequences of unchecked ambition. Every detail carried significance, both practical and historical, as survivors prepared to re-enter a world untouched by the immediate terror they had endured. The Batavia itself remained a silent monument, a vessel immobilized by natural forces, yet immortalized by human events. Its wreckage, still partially visible, was both a warning and a testament to the perils of navigation, the consequences of human cruelty, and the resilience of those who survive. Officers and survivors carried forward not only memory, but responsibility, ensuring that the events would be preserved accurately in accounts, testimony, and historical record. The Reef had claimed the ship's mobility, the island had tested morality, and human ingenuity had secured both survival and legacy. The broader implications of the mutiny extended beyond the immediate survivors. The Dutch East India Company, learning of the events, confronted questions of leadership, discipline, and accountability. Policies, practices, and oversight would be examined and modified in response to the tragedy. Yet the human dimension, the choices, compromises, and courage demonstrated by individuals remained central. The Reef immobilized the vessel. The island exposed extremes of behavior. Survival and legacy depended on human judgment, resilience, and the delicate balance of fear, courage, and morality. Even decades later, the story of the Batavia would endure. The Reef, the wreck, and the island remained silent and immutable, while the human memory of the events preserved both horror and heroism. Survivors recounted the ordeal, officers documented strategy and consequence, and historians would later reconstruct the sequence with precision and attention to the human experience. The Batavia's story, anchored in geography yet defined by human action, continued to serve as both caution and testament. The Reef, the island, and human ambition together had created a crucible that tested endurance, morality, and survival in ways no calm harbor or open ocean could predict. As the survivors sailed from the reef, the Batavia receded into memory, a combination of wood, salt, and history. The island, indifferent, waited silently for the next tide and the next generation of human ambition to encounter it. Yet the legacy endured in those who had survived, observed, and acted with courage, cunning, and resilience. The reef had immobilized a ship, the island had immobilized certainty, but human ingenuity, discipline, and endurance had secured life, justice, and the preservation of history. The story of the Batavia, of fear and courage, of cruelty and resilience, would remain a stark, enduring monument to the extremes of human experience at sea.